I found the session really useful in looking to the future and how we are going to work with schools in the future to provide the services that they need to support children with additional and special needs.
I found the training session today very informative, and I feel that this will be an excellent tool to encourage inclusive practice within schools.
The first aim and the third aim of this training was to inform you of the e-materials available to develop your provision management system and to help senior leaders in schools use appreciative inquiry. In your packs you've got a list of all the documents, and there are 9 sections on the portal, okay? And I've tried to make all the icons consistent throughout, so you will see that, you know, when it relates to a specific one. So there are, as I said, this is the overview, and there are 9 sections. Okay. The first part is talks about the overview and strategic pathway. So what is provision management 2.0 and how it aligns to other aspects of school leadership. So again, if you're here with your senior leaders, you've gained an insight. But if you need to go back, talk to your heads, talk to governors, actually there's lots of information there that will support you to do that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can just print off the PDFs and say, this is what it's about. The background to provision management, and again, you will have members of staff asking questions and FAQs, so again, there's lots of material there. Use it, don't use it, it's entirely up to you. It was created because we were trying to think of the full breadth of users. We've got delivering whole school CPD, so there are slides, models, notes, things on how you can do that. How we engage stakeholders, some more around provision management 2.0, so that's about the training. How we analyse the data, examples and resources. As I said, there are a number of examples that I've collected over the years that I've put in there, and there's an activity where they're all on one kind of document, and you've got then a grid, and you can sit around the table with staff and say, what do we like about this provision map? What do we not like about that one? It is about tailoring the provision map style to making it bespoke to your school. I do believe that a provision map should be bespoke to the ethos and the culture of the school. And then there are some templates, and finally anything to do with the local offer and the legislation going forward, including some SE7 Pathfinder updates are all in the last section. If I was online right now, I would show you that also, as the documents are updated, above it, right at the top of the page, is a section where it just says updates. And they are regularly updated, and it just clearly states these are the new documents you need to download. So you can go back to it as many times as you like. If you go back and you have difficulties downloading, one of the challenges we've had, some schools in Surrey are still using Windows 2007, and I think I've used Windows 2010. If you find that you can't open some of those documents, email me and I will happily send you earlier versions of the same document. Provision Management 2.0 really does rely and depend on a whole school approach, as Mark said earlier. It's about getting everyone involved and aligning it to the whole process, to a whole school improvement cycle. Why is that important? Okay. It really is about bridging that gap between policy and practice. Every job I've walked into, yes, they give me a policy folder as I'm employed. I read it before I start the job, and then I put it on the shelf. And you remember bits of it, and situations arise, and you go back and refer to it. But if you were to have a conversation amongst your staff and say, what is their understanding of inclusion? And ask them to put it on a post-it note. And then compare that to what's on your inclusion policy. I think you'll find that its definition in itself is problematic. But we read policies, we understand its gist, but it's about how do we embed them within the culture. A whole school approach should build on current strengths, and it should define, as a school or a setting, what is our aspirations and our current position. So this is the model of appreciative inquiry. It's a cyclical model, and it starts from defining, the first protocol, defining the topic, the affirmative topic. So in this case, it's school provision. What's our school provision? That's the topic we're talking about. It's then about sitting down with staff and colleagues and saying, what is it we do well, and how do we know? Let's just record it down. Doesn't have to be discussed, doesn't have to be challenged, just an open discussion. When we've done that, we actually start beginning to think about, well, where is it we want to be? So yeah, we've got dyslexia friendly right in some parts of the school, but it's not a whole school thing yet, maybe. So let's dream about having a whole school approach to dyslexia friendly classrooms. Then it's about designing a plan. So let's design how we're going to get there, delivering it, and then revisiting where we're at. So heads in the room, does that resonate with the school improvement cycle? Not very different, is it? So that's what we do. It's what we've been doing for a long time. It's possible that we've not just looked at it as a model for organisational change in this way. So how do we deliver that back at school? In the third section, which is whole school CPD, you'll see that there are some models. Now, I've seen it delivered in schools as a whole day inset. Okay, so the whole day spent with staff plotting wave 1, 2 and 3. What do you think the outcome would be after lunchtime? Okay. Yeah, they've had enough. It doesn't quite work. The best model is where you have 2 insets, 2 afternoon, 2 short insets. They only need to be about an hour, hour and a half each, with a gap in between. So the first inset is about getting groups to sit together, just like this, round the table, and say, let's just plot, write down everything we do well for every child in our school. So we're looking at wave 1. What is it we do for every child in our school? And some of those will be whole school. Rewards, sanctions, access to equipment. Some of those might be phase specific. So in Key Stage 2, all children have access to MFL. Yeah. In reception, all kids have access to this. So some of it may be phase specific. The groups that you put together for those conversations in primary are best when you've got mixed groups. So cross phase. There's a lot of learning that takes place. Oh, well, I do this in my classroom. I didn't know you did that. You're only down the corridor from me. Here, here's a memory stick, borrow it. And you start to see people sharing good practice. I always take a box of celebrations along because actually staff will count that meeting on such a high. If you're doing this in a secondary context, if possible, it is better to do it cross-department. So actually getting departments talking about what is it we do for every child in our school. You can still get the phase bit in there and you might still get subject, but actually that sharing and that open dialogue takes the culture to a new level. So that's your wave 1, so staff sit together. Now, if it's possible for teaching assistants and support staff to attend this, great. In some schools, it's not. Sometimes also, people driving home, you're driving home, you think, oh, but I also do this, and I forgot to put that down, or I also do that. So putting some flip charts up in the staff room for people to add their post-it notes to just after the staff meeting. Just to kind of say, oh yeah, I forgot about this. For support staff to say what they think is for every child. It's quite interesting when we do that. When I've delivered this in schools myself, I've often invited governors to attend the Wave 1 meeting and to mix in with groups. And they actually find it really fascinating to see what it is that's actually happening in the classroom. Now, if that's possible, invite the governors, not just the SEN governor, as many governors as possible. If it's not possible for the governors to be there, for whatever reason, maybe the staff could have that session, and the governors in their governing body meeting can have a session, and actually compare what do the governors think is going on compared to what the staff think. That in itself is a really fascinating model. Yeah? Because actually, do they really know what's happening in the classroom? Do they really know what it means at a practical level? A lot of schools, who've developed provision maps, and I'll ask them the question, have you shared this with the governors? Have you involved the governors? Quite often you'll get the SENCO who will say, yeah, I gave them a copy of my provision map. But they've had no dialogue about it, they've had no involvement. How can we get the children involved? We've given the children sometimes cameras and said, go and photograph your favourite learning spot in the area, in the school. They not only have to take the photo, but they have to write a sentence underneath. Or if they can't write a sentence, record a sentence. So we auditory record. You know, you get those talking tins and various recording devices. We will use those to record what it is that means to them. And And they produce a visual provision map of their learning. And it's really interesting to get conversations that open. Parents, focus groups, actually getting everyone to contribute to that wave one and define what is it that this school does for every child who walks through the door. Now, as senior leaders, you'll be ending up with loads and loads of data, loads of words, different themes, different works, things that people said. We had a really creative curriculum, we had an exciting curriculum, we had various things. Senior leaders need to then get together and pick out key themes. What themes emerge from all of those conversations? And there will be things around curriculum, there will be things around the environment, things around staff, resources, and start to pull together. But in that process, you'll get a 360 perspective on what the school community thinks of this curriculum, what the school community thinks of the environment, and where are they gaps. And that becomes your wave one. How you put it out and lay it out on paper depends on how you're going to use it. So for example, in one secondary school, the challenge was they had about, each class had about 8 or 9 IEPs in each class. The staff were really finding it difficult of using that information at the point of planning. Because we should be using information like that at the point of planning, whether we're primary colleagues or secondary colleagues. If we haven't used that information to inform our teaching, well, why are we doing it? That would be a question for me. And this was an administrative challenge for secondary colleagues because the number of children they had coming through. So they wanted a provision map that was 1 page, and they got it down to 1 page, and they had, I think, 3 or 4 themes. And some were teacher strategies and some were student strategies. And at the end, they had a column, a blank column. So in the teacher strategies, under quality first, keywords was one of them, for example, purposeful seating. For each class, the information they were given traditionally on IEPs, they would put onto that. So they would put the initial of a child who needed, say, had a hearing aid, couldn't be seated near the projector because of the noise, or someone with ASD. So they just put the child's initial and just put away from distraction. They had a child there who could only have 5 keywords, so they just put keywords, Johnny, 5. So when they came to planning their lessons, it was a 1-page reminder of the things they needed to take into account when planning their lessons for that class. And from a secondary specialist point of view, when it is sometimes like a conveyor belt, isn't it? When you're teaching full day on, it can be that you can class after class, and to take into account those individual needs within Quality First can be a challenge. Within the primary context, how can that class list become something that's actually informing and taking differentiation to a new level? So how you develop that wave one, what it looks like, will depend on what you're going to use it. If you're going to publish it on your website for parents, what will the presentation look like that? If you're going to use it for a monitoring form as part of your evaluation, what will that look like? The content will be the same, but how it's presented will change. So you have your wave one. That was your first inset meeting. After this break and all that data has been analysed, another further second meeting, the second inset is for wave 2 and 3. And if you think about the triangle, that should get less and less. So you actually only need 1 meeting to define wave 2 and 3. In the primary context, again, I would encourage this time to sit either, have groups, but either in phases or key stage, or if you've got 3-4 entry, 3-4 entry, go for year groups. Okay? And for secondary colleagues, to do it within departments. Okay? So to think about wave 2 and wave 3. And again, it's a simple, same dialogue. What is it we do for our children at wave 2? And how do we know it works? And start to list that down. Now, there may be some additional information that you might need. If you say phonics intervention, you might want to say what phonics intervention you're using, or if you're doing a fine gross motor skills program, what you're using. You might need to get down to some specifics, but actually it's just logging what you're doing. The wave 3 will help to develop individual provision maps from that and support transition data. And we were talking earlier in the break around, if you think about it, if you've got a primary school that's embedded provision management and you're passing on information to your secondary colleagues, actually you could give them annotated provision maps. And that would really inform secondary colleagues about what works in the primary context that they could start to think about in the secondary context. When APP speaking and listening came out, you know, the materials, the support materials for the speaking and listening, they were brilliant. There were some really good videos of children in year 6, really articulate, standing at the front of the classrooms, delivering talks. And we showed them to some secondary colleagues who taught English. They could not believe these were the year 6 that were now their year 7. Something obviously happens in that summer in the big school and they change, and we all know that. But it was only when they saw how they were and how articulate they were in year 6 that they suddenly realised this is where we need to push the aspirations to, because we know they can do it. So I think we could use that kind of information to support transition. We can use that information to collect long-term evidence about someone's ongoing needs. All of this has been put into place, however they're not making the expected rates of progress, and the gap is widening. Provision management was originally brought in to reduce the administrative burden of special educational needs. I sincerely and genuinely believe if you put in a system in place and you embed it and you take time to do that, it does reduce the amount of admin you need for special educational needs. You will see a difference within a year. I certainly did a SENCO. It cut down the paperwork enormously, and it made whatever piece of paper we did produce meaningful and useful. Staff were using the papers we were producing. Prior to that, we had numerous IEPs floating around that were filed, quite frankly, or brought out at the time of review. And I wanted staff to use them at the point of planning. I wanted that information to be used at the point of planning, because for me, that's how quality work is delivered. You have information about a child, you know their needs, and you use it to plan a lesson. So we need to start thinking, how do we encourage staff and colleagues to use that information at the point of planning? Because if we get it right at the point of planning, delivery will flow naturally anyhow. Yeah. And that's a challenge, because that's a different way of thinking around it. So that's the appreciative inquiry. So it's 2 staff meetings with a space in between. And some additional activities where you get governors involved, you get teachers and support staff involved, you get parents involved. At the end of that, you will have a whole school provision map, plus offshoots and these other layers of individual group maps, maybe subject maps, based maps. In terms of finance, we will talk about that, so particularly if heads of department in a secondary school take on responsibility for Wave 2, and some of the Wave 2 interventions come out of their budget. And again, it's a shift in the way people think, because at the moment, quite a lot of secondary schools I talk to will say, that has to come out of the SEN budget. Well actually, if it's a gap in learning, or it's low attainment, whose budget should it really come out of? Okay, and that's a challenge that you can put in place once you have the system in place and the structure. Okay, so as I said, there are materials in the learning section on how to deliver the SEN CPD, and it goes through exactly what I've said, those two in-set sessions. There are draft slides, there are some templates where you can just record everyone's answers, not templates of how your map looks, but just something that you can actually do your brainstorming on. And there is also, you could do an additional activity after those 2 sessions and say, here's a whole sample of provision maps, let's just evaluate which ones we like, what's the use behind them, how would you use them? Okay? And that gets them thinking about what a provision map might look like. So prep, a lot of it's done for you, yes? And these are tried and tested. I have actually delivered these in school, learned from mistakes, learnt where it's worked, learnt where it's not worked, and put all of that into that. Yeah. I think the other thing I need to emphasise though is it is an ongoing process. The best time to deliver this is around the autumn term. However, this is not a one-off process. If you developed your provision maps in September, why is September a good time to do this, do you think? To have that conversation about what is it we do for every child. Why would September, autumn? It sets you up for the year, new staff on board, and it's re-emphasising this is what we want to achieve in the year. If you developed your maps and you use them throughout the year and you use them as part of transition in the summer term, come the following September, we revisit that conversation. So the Wave 1 comes back out. This is what we defined as Wave 1 last year. Do we still do that? Or have we added to it? Have we moved on? What have we added to this? And you begin to see how the school is evolving in capacity building, where the areas have been moved on, and where areas sometimes have been slacked. Sometimes when you talk to colleagues in the profession, they talk about it's like spinning plates, and you hold on to this plate and you lose sight of the other plate. Having an annual process like this actually brings the community, the school community together to really reinforce and re-embed. This is what we do for every child. So it's an annual process. It needs to be put into the annual calendar. So if you've got that annual process in place, you do this, then your first assessment cycle in the autumn term can align to the individual provision maps that or group provision maps that you've put in place. So you can begin to see it as a whole school approach. Can you see how now the assessment comes along? It will reduce your paperwork phenomenally. Initially there's an input that's needed, but once that's in place and you've got a cycle going, within 2 years you will actually see a huge difference, and also to your workloads. Okay, in the synthesising and analysing data, again there is some information around how you develop that thematic approach. How do you pull out the themes? And the examples that I've given you are all very different. Some have gone, as I said, for things like curriculum, environment. Some have used also the 4 aspects of the code of practice, so cognition and learning, behaviour, speech language communication need, and physical medical. There is no fixed format. Okay? There's absolutely no fixed format to a provision map. Okay? I strongly believe that. The provision map should reflect your school, your setting, and what you want it to be. Okay? And so when you design it, think about how you're going to use it. What's the purpose behind it? Who's the audience? And how will it be used? Okay? And as I said earlier, Wave 1 can be used, the content can be presented in a variety of ways depending on how you're going to use it. So you just might have it as a one-page visual on your website for parents. You can translate that into a monitoring form, you can translate that into a recruitment form. There's a whole variety of things you can do. You can link it into performance management. Okay? It can be developed in so many different ways. Okay, which brings us nicely onto the strategic overview. This lovely diagram that you have here. So, this is the bit where you've plotted the map. You've had those 2 inset sessions, and you've plotted your map as a whole school community. There needs to be some work after that around analysing the map. Particularly Wave 2 and Wave 3 interventions. Are they working? And if they're not, do we need to replace them? In one school where we developed this, it was a primary school, and all through primary school, they had a number of resources in the cupboard that they had brought into, good quality resources, things that had been researched, and they were sitting in the cupboard, but there wasn't a single member of staff in the support staff trained to deliver any of those. And the provision map brought that out very clearly. And so what they did is actually linked it into staff training and performance management. And for that year, each teaching assistant was trained up in a different using a different resource, which they had to share with their colleagues. So by the end of that year, all of them had been trained up in using those resources that in September had been stuck in a cupboard. Were they affecting children's learning and raising standards and progress? For sure. Because actually they had been having these materials but not using them. So it begins to help define what's on offer. In terms of moving forward and the world we're moving to, there are some key principles that are going to come out of the new world. One of them is person-centred planning. Okay? It's not new. Secondary colleagues might have already been using it from year 9 onwards anyhow. It's not new. It's been around. Henderson Associates have been talking about it since 2000. But it is a better way of running annual reviews. So the annual review process will become person-centred planning. There is going to be what we call co-production of education and healthcare plans. Okay? Much more involvement of parents and carers, but also I think schools, the receiving schools, I think will have and should have a much more say in some of the production of the plans. And the third principle is it's going to be outcomes-based accountability. Again, not a new principle. Right? It's been around for a while. We are going to need to start stating the expected outcome of an intervention. So if you buy in 3 hours of speech and language therapy, what is your expected outcome from that commission? What will they deliver, and how will you know they've delivered? And that's quite a different way of working for health professionals. Well, health are actually better at commissioning, but for us to be asking those questions beforehand about what we think will be the expected outcome. So we can link that into outcomes-based target setting and the data collection. Cost, we start to look at value for money of interventions. If a teaching assistant is delivering, say, phonics, 1 hour a day or 20 minutes a day even, every day for 6 weeks, what's the impact versus that cost? And actually, is it having that impact? Do we have a different phonics intervention from what we teach in our mainstream? Because quite often, and I'm not saying it's anyone in the room, but I've been into primary schools where they'll have, say, read, write, ink, or letters and sounds, or anything as their main teaching phonics. And then when you say to them, well, what's your intervention? Children who haven't got it, more of the same. Okay. Now, we've done a lot of work nationally on phonics, and we should be at that point now where schools are able to say we have a core phonics curriculum, which we use for teaching, but actually if children don't get it at that point, we've now got an additional intervention, and that's what we're using. And that's what the phonics funding, match funding, was designed to bring about, that schools begin to differentiate between what is core teaching and what is going to be that differentiation. I was called into work in a PRU, and there was a year 9 lad who was kicking off big time. And we went through his records, and he was on letters and sounds phase 1. Okay, now if you think about what that means, it's all about discriminatory sound. And I went back through his records, and he'd been doing the same activities since year 4. 5 years of the same activities. Is it any wonder he kicked off? Hadn't had a hearing test in that time. Okay, the amount of times I've been on panel and I've had to say, so where's the hearing test behind this child's learning? Right. Key things. And they hadn't picked up that he had a working memory issue. He couldn't hold. So if you had a CVC, 3 letters, 3 sounds in a word, he could hold the first 2, and by the time he got to the third, he'd lost the first 2. So he couldn't hold more than 2 pieces of information in his head at any time. Just his working memory load. No one had done interventions around working memory. No one had looked at his hearing. We didn't even know if he had good hearing, or whether he had grommets or anything like that. We had no idea whether he had intermittent hearing. And for 5 years, he had had letters and sounds phase 1 over and over again. Okay, so we need to think about how are we using progressive interventions. If something doesn't work, either the intervention's wrong, our identification is wrong, or the way we're delivering is wrong. It's that simple, folks, and we need to really get down to being quite frank with ourselves about saying, why isn't it working, and what do we need to do differently? We've already talked about how, using appreciative inquiry, you begin to start thinking, well, where do we want to dream? And that links into your school improvement plan. But equally, self-evaluation, Ofsted walked through the door. This is our wave 1, by the way. Right, this is what we do. That's a really constructive conversation. Our wave 2 interventions, this is how we've been tracking data against the interventions. So you can use that as your evidence. Performance management can be linked into that. Moderation and standardisation. So those assessment cycles that we have already in school, again, fit into that wave 1 cycle, and wave 2 and wave 3 build on it. In terms of the new world, and why is it provision management 2.0? Provision management has been around for a while, it's not new. The 2.0, I think, is where we've got to start now including external partners on our provision maps. Who is it we work with? Who is our speech and language therapist? Who is our educational psychologist? Because if I was a parent and I had the option to take a personal budget and I took that option, as a school, I would rather they worked with someone we know than bringing in someone else. Okay, we've got to think around that. What will parents do? If they want someone new to work with dyslexia, what's the first thing parents go and do? Yes, they get someone private sometimes in to test them, and this is not. I'm not looking at anyone individually or pointing anything or even thinking of anyone. But invariably, I've seen a number of private dyslexia assessments who all say we can cure this child's dyslexia with 10 sessions with us. Yeah, and you think, wow, yeah. Okay, and parents, they want a fix, they want a quick fix. But if they know that we're working with professionals, we can actually encourage them to work with us. We can actually say we've got speech and language therapists that we know, that we've built a relationship with. A school was buying a speech and language therapist who was working with a child in school. Parents who were buying a speech and language therapist working with a child at home. We think great, getting great provision. The only problem was both speech and language therapists didn't actually agree with each other. So the annual review was a real riot, you can imagine. And the parents were caught up in this battle between the professionals. Really unfair on the parents. Really unfair on them. So we've got to think about how we can educate them that we've got these relationships with external partners. The local offer is as much for schools as it is for parents. I have been in scenarios where a child has said to me, I do not want provision on site because it's not street cred. Okay, this was particularly where it was a very bright lad, he needed counselling, and actually I spoke to his mum and we got a voluntary organisation to run some counselling sessions for him off site, and mum took him. In this day and age, if I was looking for that, I would go to the local offer and look at what's out there and how can I signpost mum to these various organisations. So please bear in mind the local offer is as much for schools working with voluntary and community organisations as it is for parents. Okay, it is a two-way dialogue and it is there for you to use as well. And that is part of the whole point of the local offer. And if you've got a parent who brings in a private individual, there are issues around school, who's going to monitor the outcomes? There are issues around making sure safeguarding has been met. All those kind of things we're going to need to start doing. So I think it's important we start educating parents now. These are professionals we work with, we have good relationships with them. If you feel that your child needs that, let's talk about it, let's see how we can do this. Now I appreciate health and social care, there are shortages, and this is something we're going to have to work through the system. The system isn't going to change overnight, but the professionals that I've talked to, the educational psychologists, health professionals, when we've talked about, how would you feel, especially as teachers, being on a school's provision map, knowing that you are part of their school community, they have really welcomed the opportunity. And then they can strategically also plan their time around school. Yeah? Okay? Having been there and as a specialist teacher, and when you're spread across a whole authority, it is quite a challenge how you manage your time. Okay? No matter with the best will in the world, you want to be there for every child in school. But actually, things that did help me was when schools had good systems in place and had that communication with parents. So we can put on external partners. We've talked a lot about research, evidence-based materials. We're going to add some materials to the website on this. But actually, what needs changing? How do we know? What research do we get behind any of the interventions we use? How do we inform parents of this? And how do we use that research to move on? What research are we doing in-house as well? Yeah, I think we've got to get better at that. It's not new. If you think about David Hargreaves, he's been talking about this for 30 odd years. Tim Brinkhouse, this is not new. I think what possibly is new is the way it's been presented. Evidence-based is not necessarily just anecdotal, neither is it pure statistical, it's about finding that balance. Okay, I'll leave it at that. So can you see how then it fits into the bigger picture of the whole school approach? Okay, the second aim was to look at, if you've got provision mapping in place, and some of you have got that, we don't want you to throw out the baby with the bathwater. What we want to say is, well, let's look at what you've got in place, and what can you keep for the new world moving forward, and which bits do you really need to kind of park. So in your packs is an evaluation form, not evaluation form, sorry, criteria checklist. Okay, if you look at your criteria checklist. Okay, and again thinking around the three areas, process, system and output. Very simple questions, and you might be able to do that now with your senior leader here, or you might want to go back. So very simply, does the process you have for developing your provision maps include a whole school approach? Is everyone engaged in that process? Either they are, they're not, or you've got to comment or you've got to think about it. Do all your stakeholders have an opportunity to contribute? Does your current provision management system align with your school improvement plan and therefore is reviewed annually? And again, that's a challenge because quite a lot of schools develop provision maps but not necessarily review them on an annual basis. In terms of your system, does your current provision mapping system clearly define wave 1, 2 and 3. Is there clarity across the school in the difference between low attainment, gap in learning, developmental delay and special educational need? And that may be a question to kind of go back and ask and have that dialogue. And finally, the output. Does your current provision maps management system provide you and other stakeholders with information about what's available, the cost, the resource allocation, so how much time that is can be sometimes. Do we cost the SENCO time in some of the things that we do? Yeah? I think, we need to start thinking about that as well. And the impact and the quality of delivery, so how we're monitoring quality. And the last one says about how does your current system help you map 14 questions of the local offer. I will come on to that and explain what that is. And then there are boxes for you to start thinking around what works well and what you might need to change. Now, if you don't have a provision mapping system in place at all, you would probably maybe go down the no side. If you've got provision mapping in place, I would be very surprised if you went down no on all of them. You might have wave 2 and 3 in place, which has been the pattern that we've seen across Surrey, but wave 1 hasn't been embedded. So you can answer some of them, well actually we've got this bit, but we need to develop that bit. We are not asking you to really start from scratch. We want you to build on what you're already doing, if it works for you. Okay? Some have come to this training and actually said, the model we're using at the moment doesn't work for me, and I want to redo it completely. And if that's where you're at, that's a full 2-3 year plan. It's not an overnight job. Okay? When I took over SENCO in one school, I didn't like the way that it was done. I scrapped it and we started again completely differently. But that was where I was at. Doesn't mean that that's where everyone's at. So take time when you go back to your schools to really evaluate your own current system. And I would say be kind to yourselves. Okay? We've made this form simple to help provoke discussion and dialogue, but not for it to be black and white to say, well, we do, we don't, we'll have to start again. I think there are models of good practice already in place and we just need to build on that. Some schools have actually in their federations decided to work together on this. So you might be, with a partner school and say, well, we'll design the training, we'll deliver it at your school, we'll deliver it at our school together. I know from Milton Keynes, where we've got a lot of village schools up in the north, actually we did a provision map across all the village schools and they developed different expertise, special needs in those areas. So there are different models out there. It doesn't have to be a solo journey. Okay? But please don't feel, this is I had when someone comes to the training and said, well, we haven't done any of this. We've got provision mapping in place, but we didn't do any of this. And we unpacked their provision map. There was a lot in place. Okay, so just think about it from that perspective. So, we talked about the evaluation grid. Future evidence. One of the things in designing this that I was really keen for, and I still hold true, is I do believe we need to reduce the bureaucratic burden of special education needs. I think we've got caught up in some of the paperwork. And we're thinking around what evidence will need to be in place for education healthcare plans. When I became a SENCO, the first half term, my teaching assistants came up to me on the Friday with these folders. This thick, these lever arch folders? These are our notes from all the children we've worked with for this half term. The previous SENCO used to read them over half term. Okay, I'm sorry, but I did that half term because I wanted to see what kind of notes they were doing. But what became very apparent to me was I had some teaching assistants who would write odd single sentences which didn't actually tell me very much, and others who wrote reams and reams and reams. That it was a whole story, and I actually relived nearly every lesson they'd been into. And actually, my priority for the next half term was to kind of sort out an administration system that they were clear, whatever they recorded helped move my understanding on and the child on. Otherwise, I didn't want to know. And if you've had pieces of paper in your office and stuff like that that doesn't help you do your job or doesn't help a child move on, bin it. Because actually, what is the purpose behind that document? And we have, in some situations, got into a habit of creating paperwork for the sake of it. We need to think about everything we do, how does it move us forward? Now, how does this link into funding and education healthcare plans? The funding document, the national funding document around special educational needs came out in June 2012. and it did propose a significant change in the way SEN was going to be funded. So every school has their ORPU, which is their core budget for each pupil, around £3,000 to £4,000 per pupil. Okay? Where do you think Wave 1 costs come from? The ORPUs. So if you've got an inclusive approach, if you've got an aspiration to become a dyslexia-friendly classroom at Wave 1, the costing for that should come from that ORPU. Okay, and that's about shifting how we think. Now, I know I've got one bursar in the room, but really the other bursars in the room. Ah, okay. But you will need to go and work with your bursars on this. It's not for you to do on your own, but it is significant to think about. So that should come out of that. Then there is the notional SEN budget that is now going directly into schools. In Surrey, there is a transition period, but eventually it will get to a point where it's 6,000, so it's up to 10,000 comes from within the school budget. Okay, up to £10,000. So when paperwork eventually goes to panel, what will be the future panels, one of the questions that will, I think, need to be asked, and they're still designing this and they're still trying it, what have you done so far, and show us how you have spent that money and tell us the impact. Now, we're not looking for pennies and pounds here, but actually we need to see that there has been significant provision put in place at Wave 1 and with the notional SEN budget before additional funding is provided. Now, for some schools, particularly special schools, this became a challenge because actually special schools originally, they just got 10,000 per pupil, and then they have to apply on top of that for additional funding. Because additional to 10,000 is where you apply. Now, I've kind of aligned it to the 3 waves, okay? But there is a caveat to that. And I should have said earlier that there are sometimes provision that we have in place in schools that can be in all 3 waves. So if we take in the primary context the use of visual timetables, I think we said earlier that we use it as a whole school Wave 1. Yeah, we have it. And within that we have progression, so that in reception class it's down here, and we're using photos, and then by the time they get to year 6 it's placed there on the wall. We might be using symbols. Okay. So we've got that as a Wave 1 progressive strategy. But at Wave 2, we may have a young lad or a girl who actually struggles with dressing for swimming, say. And we use a version of a task list, with the Velcro, to kind of help them know which order to get dressed and undressed. So we might develop a smaller version of that. We might use a structured chart, first, second, next or third, whatever, at Wave 3. Now that's not going to cost more than £10,000, and although that's a Wave 3, it's not necessarily above the 10,000. Do you see what I'm saying? But I'm saying you can have the same sort of provision in all 3. But from a funding point of view, we need to start thinking around Wave 1 comes from the ORPU funding, because Wave 1 is whose responsibility? Everyone's. Wave 2 can be different budgets. In secondary, it could be some of the departments. Okay. In primary, the notional SEN budget, and then Wave 3, we may need to look at additional funding. Not always necessary. So, moving forward, the one proposal that's going forward is part of the evidence that will need to be put forward. And remember, this has been rolled out to every school in Surrey. That an annotated provision map, Wave 1 map, what works for the child and your person and the impact. Wave 2 maps, what's been put in place for additional, what's been the cost, what's been the entry data, exit data, the attendance alongside that, and that can be internally delivered or externally. And what is the proposal? What is additionally required? What are the additional arrangements needed at Wave 3 or beyond, and how will this support the needs? Okay, so that's the plan for in terms of that. Now these are still being trialled, and these are still draft proposals. Okay? And I think, yeah, Susan's point is very valid. Stick with what it is at the moment until you are told otherwise, because until the legislation shifts, a lot of this actually cannot shift legally as well, and we have to balance that out. Okay, so the schools, we've talked about how you develop your provision maps in the schools. We've talked about what process you might engage others. But this is all leading to one clear thing, that each school and every setting, college setting, and school needs to submit their school offer part of the local offer. So the SE7, which Surrey is part of, defines some principles. I appreciate you may not be able to read it very clearly, but they define some principles around what would the local offer look like? And that document is available on the website. Parents and carers, mainly through family voice and parent partnership, defined, well, it was originally 13 questions, it's now 14 questions for all settings that they should provide information on. These questions are not new. Okay? There are things around the curriculum, there are things around who do I contact, what happens for provision. Things that actually is already out there, but parents felt, we don't understand this. I mapped these against the waves of provision, and that mapping is, that visual is actually on the e-materials as well, so you can see how those align. Now, if we have those 13 questions, and the questions are quite ambiguous, and I'll show you a sample of this, we could have some schools who are responding and putting 2 or 3 sentences, and other schools who are writing paragraphs and paragraphs. When we put all of this onto the portal, how does it help a parent realistically compare schools? So instead, what we've done is we've kind of thought, what have we done in the past that's been good practice? And we've developed a self-audit grid. So you will have 13 questions, and you'll have emerging, establishing, and enhanced. Ring a bell with anyone? Been around that block before? And there are statements within each quadrant, within each cell, which you cut and paste into a response form, which is a best fit for you, and you submit that to the local authority as your local offer. And we'll need to add in some keywords and things to support the search engine part. We're still working on that. But that fundamentally will be your annual local offer. Okay? And an additional question will be there every year to say, what provision have you added this year? So if you were to go onto the local offer and see your school, you would see each year an uploaded PDF from your school every year, just answering those 13, 14 questions. Okay? So, this is an example of the first 5 or 6 questions. Okay, you can see that they are quite ambiguous. If we were to just say to schools, fill this in, you could write a paragraph, or you could write 2 lines, depending on where you were at. And actually, once that's uploaded, it's in the public domain. So it made sense to have statements in each of those areas. So what's the timeline? We're delivering the CPD at the moment, so this we'll deliver the last one, the 8th day of training will be on Friday, and then we will have done 2 days in every quadrant. By the end of autumn term, okay, we would like you to have gone through the self-audit grid and cut and paste your responses to the response form, converting that to PDF and send that to someone at the area office.
Susan.
Send it to Susan because the Alphas are collecting this, sorry. Send it to Susan, and alongside that, your wave 1 provision map. Now, I take on board the comment, this is quite late and you may have already set all your CPD. Okay, you may have already set up all your CPD for this term. If that's the case, if you say, go back to Susan and say, well, I'll send in my provision map in January because we're going to do our inset then, that's not going to be a problem. What we do need, though, is your completed response form by the end of term, early January. And the reason for that is all of them are going to be uploaded in one go. Okay, so if you think about all the schools in Surrey, we have to upload this to the local offer. It's easier to do it in one go than to do it in batches. So we need to get this to the guys who are going to be managing the portal by February. And then you revisit this, as we said, every year. So every year you resubmit, you redo your provision maps and you resubmit your local offer. The other reason for putting descriptors in is anything you publish within a month, it will be out of date. So if you kind of said we've got 10 teaching assistants who have all been specialist trained in X, Y, and Z, and then they all, not all of them, but half of them leave, that becomes out of date. So we've kind of kept it in a way that wouldn't make the information out of date, but could be updated. So we've had to think around some of those issues as well, because this will be out there for parents to look at. We have to be aware of how they will receive it and how they will take it on board. Okay? So we've talked about how you can access the e-materials. Oh yes, and this film obviously will be, we're hoping to have this out by half term on YouTube. So if you wanted to revisit the training, you're welcome to do that. There's an article coming out in SEND Bites, the next SEND Bites, unpacking appreciative inquiry a bit further as well. So if you wanted, there is a lot on the portal already around appreciative inquiry and theory behind it. And then there's also a national article coming out in Special Education magazine around how this links to Pathfinder. So we've got a couple of publications coming out, so that will give you that background information.
Why do you think it's important for schools and colleges to define their Wave 1 provision through a whole school dialogue?
A whole school dialogue is the groundwork that will reinforce everyone's responsibility to identify and provide in order to meet the additional needs of some of their learners. You do not build a house from the second floor.
The South East region within Surrey is one of the trial areas for the Phase 2 SEND Pathfinder Project. How will provision maps support the way forward?
Well, what we want to do is build on schools' prior learning in relation to provision management. And Provision Management 2.0 and the provision maps are the processes and tools necessary to ensure robust, consistent and transparent sharing of information with families through individual discussion, requests for an education, health and care plan, as well as for the school's element of the local offer. The schools participating in the South East trial will be able to road test, and the learning will inform the wider rollout of the implementation of new processes across Surrey in preparation for September 2014.
I found the training this afternoon really useful, especially in respect of the Wave 1, Wave 2 and Wave 3 aspect of special needs. That's an area that I think I certainly will take back to school and think about the CPD with the staff. Working with the staff as a whole is an area that we do well, I believe, in school, but it's something that we can always improve on, and involving all stakeholders in looking at the provision management and the provision mapping in order to support our children is an area that I really am interested in seeing through this term.
It was very reassuring to know that the provision mapping and the provision management that's in place in my school at the moment is upon the same hymn sheet as our speaker today from Anita. I thought what was interesting was sort of raising the profile of Wave 1 and Wave 2 and Wave 3 provision within my school, and that's something that I'm certainly going to take away from this training today.
I found today's training by Anita Devi really valuable, because it made us reflect actually on how important provision mapping is for SEND children in the strategic context of the school. At our school, we've done a lot to ensure that all pupils are given what they need to achieve their best potential. And what we've realised today is you've got to increase the accountability really for SEND pupils right down at the teacher level. This isn't an accountability that rests only with the SENCO or with the deputy or the head teacher. It rests right down at grassroots with everyone in the organisation, and particularly the teacher.